The focus of this video is on the inner ear. We discussed the development of the outer ear and the middle ear, and now we can discuss the development of the inner ear. It roughly begins around 7 weeks, which is during the embryologic period. However, the ear and its physiologic capabilities, they are the first sensory system to develop during the fetal stage. So if you remember back to embryology, that all kinds of things were being created during that period of time. During the fetal stage is when those organs begin to differentiate and decide what is going to be what. So the inner ear starts very early on. In fact, it's the very first sensory system that develops in the fetal stage. The cochlea is completely, or I should say the inner ear is completely developed by about 35 weeks. But it is somewhat functional, meaning that fetuses can detect sound in utero starting around the 28th or the 29th week. Again, this is variable because we can't exactly pinpoint weeks, but we know that in the last trimester, that fetuses do and can respond to sound. This schemata here represents, here's the early developing fetus, and where the auricle or pinna and the external auditory meatus are developing. And at the same time, the inner ear, and we can even see over here that some of the nerve fibers are already beginning to develop. So here is the inner ear at the same time. And this is the size of the inner ear at each week. We have two divisions in the inner ear. We have an osseous or bony labyrinth. I'm just going to say to you that osseous and bony mean the same thing. I try to stick with one or the other, but they are interchangeable. So sometimes I may say osseous labyrinth, and sometimes I may say bony labyrinth. They mean the same thing. So if I say osseous, it can also be the bony labyrinth. Then we have the membranous labyrinth. So the membranous labyrinth is another part of the inner ear, and that part of the inner ear is inside of the bony labyrinth. So the bony labyrinth kind of forms a shell, a bony shell around this membranous labyrinth. It's sort of protective because all of the sensory mechanisms that give us our physiologic capabilities of hearing and balance, they reside within the membranous labyrinth. Parts of the cochlea and the vestibular system are located in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. There's just one little piece that is in the squamous, but for the most part, the inner ear structures are carved out of. So when I'm talking about the osseous labyrinth or the bony labyrinth, that is carved out of the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So the petrous portion, if you remember, is the hardest section. There's just one small area where the squamous portion is part of. But we're just going to focus on the petrous portion of the temporal bone. If not to confuse again, the osseous labyrinth is also referred to as the otic capsule. Otic for ear, and capsule meaning that it encapsulates the membranous labyrinth. So we have three names, excuse me, for the osseous labyrinth. Osseous labyrinth, bony labyrinth, and otic capsule. I prefer bony labyrinth, and I use that more than anything, but on a labeling or a diagram, you could use either or. The osseous or bony labyrinth has three sections. The first section is called the vestibule. The vestibule is in the center here, right in the middle, and on one end we have the semicircular canals, and on the other end we have the cochlea. Okay, so the vestibule is really continuous with the semicircular canals. Excuse me. On the lateral wall of the bony labyrinth is the oval window. On the opposite, or the medial wall, contains the vestibular aqueduct. And the vestibular aqueduct is where cochlear fluids flow from. So it's on the other side. If I could turn this around, if I could flip it around, it's on the other side of this structure here is where the vestibular aqueduct is. I'm going to stay here for just a minute and talk about the semicircular canals. Okay. We have three semicircular canals in each ear. Okay, so this area represents one bony labyrinth of one ear, and it shows all the parts of the bony labyrinth. So here's the vestibule, the cochlea, semicircular canals. The semicircular canals, there are three of, and they lie in planes that are 45-degree angles from each other. The names of the semicircular canals are the superior, and the reason it's called the superior is because it lies above the other two. Sometimes you'll see this called the anterior, but we're going to call it the superior, always and forever. The superior canal shares a wall or an arm, we see this called the common crus, with the posterior canal. Okay, so the posterior canal is called posterior because it lies behind the other two. And then we have the lateral canal, which we sometimes will see called the horizontal canal, and I actually prefer horizontal. So lateral, sorry, it takes me a while to write. Lateral equals horizontal. And that is because it lays in the horizontal plane. All right, so then we can look at the semicircular canals again. And this shows the semicircular canals with the vestibular and the cochlear nerve input. There are three, again, when you go back here, the superior, the posterior, and the superior and the posterior kind of share a canal wall. And then we have the lateral, also known as the horizontal. If you'll notice where the semicircular canals fit into this vestibule area, they widen a little bit. Okay, so if you'll see this widening here, widening, there's a widening here, and a widening here, and then we can't see the widening back here of the common wall. Those widenings, as they fit into the vestibule, are referred to as the ampulla. So there are 6 semicircular canals, but only 5 ampulla because of this shared wall. Collectively, when we look at the semicircular canals and the vestibule, we refer to them as the vestibular apparatus because this group over here represents or provides all of the information for balance. Okay, so this is the vestibular section. And the reason it lies in 3 planes is so that it can capture head movements as we move our head. So we'll talk more about this when we get into the physiology of the semicircular canals, but they lie in 3 planes and they are 45-degree angles from each other. This is just a representation that shows, and this is not an accurate at all diagram. It does show you the relationship, though, of the cochlear and vestibular apparatus in addition to the middle ear and the outer ear. So we have our ear canal, which we call the external auditory meatus, the tympanic membrane, which constitutes the outer ear. We have the middle ear here with the ossicles. You'll notice that the footplate of the stapes is fitting into the oval window, which is actually located in the vestibule, but it's also the opening of the cochlea. And then the semicircular canals. This is the this is the bony cochlea, and so this shows you how the cochlea is carved out of the temporal bone. At the base of the bony cochlea, there is an internal acoustic or auditory meatus. Some people call it acoustic internal. Internal auditory meatus. Okay, so that is at the base of the bony cochlea. At the very top, we have the helicotrema, which is, I just noticed, is right here. So here is the helicotrema. Okay, so the bony cochlea runs from the internal auditory meatus all the way up to the helicotrema. Okay, so from the base at the internal auditory meatus to the apex, okay, so the bottom part is called the base. The helicotrema area is called the apex, and that means top. Okay, so from the base to the apex, the bony cochlea winds around a bony core for about 35 millimeters. The bony core, the bony core of the cochlea is called the modiolus. Okay, and excuse me, the modiolus is this section right in here. So you see this core right in this area. Okay, this is the modiolus. So the modiolus runs from the base to the apex. The top is the apex, bottom is base. I think I said that, but just to reiterate it again. Okay, so this area in here is the modiolus, and that is the bony core of the cochlea. Then we have these turns that are wrapped around, and you can also see that they're represented by the red. Okay, so the red represents the twisting. So this is spiraled or twisted around the bony core of the cochlea. Again, the bony core is called the modiolus. The bony cochlea is carved around this core, and it curves about 2.5 to 2 3/4 turns. So here's 1 full turn, 2 full turns, and then here's the 1/2 to 3/4 turn up here. And we'll look at that in just a minute. Also, to give you a frame of reference for the semicircular canals, the openings for the semicircular canals are over in this section. This is a cochlea image taken from a scanning electron microscope. Okay, so what you see here, and this is fabulous. I absolutely love this. Here we have the modiolus, which is really perfect. You can see it. It's kind of a fuzzy gray or black. The white areas here, okay, they represent the bony section of the cochlea. So some of it has been removed. And then these areas here, these darker areas represent, and we haven't gotten to this yet, but the membranous labyrinth that is mostly made up of nerve fibers along a membrane. Okay, so this gives you an excellent picture of the cochlea, and it's an actual image. It's an image that's blown up about 500,000 times to give us an idea or an image of something that's 35 millimeters in length. Yet another picture. Again, this shows a cross section with part of the cochlea removed. We have our first section. Going through here. So here we have the first turn of the cochlea. Here we have the second turn. And here we have the third turn, which is not complete. So we have the stapes in the oval window, and sound goes up the top chamber. So there's a top chamber, and when it gets to the top chamber, then it comes back down the bottom chamber. The top chamber is referred to as the scala vestibuli. That represents the top chamber of the bony cochlea. The bottom chamber is called the scala tympani. Okay, so there's, excuse me, a top chamber called the scala vestibuli and a bottom chamber called the scala tympani. And they are protecting the middle layer, which is the membranous labyrinth, which we haven't gotten to yet. Yet another view, and this is a view that I include because it shows how, so down here we have the internal auditory meatus. Okay. So we know that the cochlea runs from the internal auditory meatus all the way up to the ilicotrema. The modiolus is this area right in the middle here. And so the internal auditory meatus is where where the cochlear nerve enters into the cochlear portion. And you can see how it kind of goes up through the modiolus and innervates each area. Okay, so again, we have our first turn, our second turn, and our third turn. Here's another image, and this is another scanning electron microscope image. So this is blown up about 500,000 times so that we can have a really good visual. Okay, so we have the upper chamber here, which is the scala vestibuli, and we have the bottom chamber here, which is the scala tympani. Okay, and again, we have our turns. There's 1, 2, and then the third turn that isn't complete there. This is another older image that gives the same information. Oops, let me go back. And so we have the vestibular membrane, which separates the scala vestibuli from the interior section called the scala media, which is the cochlea, or the membranous labyrinth, and we have the scala tympani down here, which is separated by another membrane called the basilar membrane. So I just want to draw a picture here. Let me go back here, and I don't know what happened. All right, let's. All right, so we're going to draw, kind of looks like Pac-Man, right? All right, we have the scala vestibuli up here. We have the scala tympani. Down here. This membrane here, I'm just darkening it. Okay, that is the vestibular. Or Reisner's membrane. Okay, that membrane separates the scala vestibuli from the membranous labyrinth. And spell membranous right. Alright, then we have the other membrane that's on the bottom that is stretched across here. Okay. And that membrane is the basilar membrane. And that stretches across the floor, or I'm sorry, across the top of the scala tympani. And it stretches all the way from the bottom to the top, or the base to the apex. And then in the next lecture, we'll talk about this section that is in between them, which is the scala media, or the membranous part of the cochlea. So that really concludes the bony labyrinth of the inner ear, and we will get to, on the next video, we will get to the membranous portion of both the vestibular section and the cochlear section.